Presentation overview. I'm going to talk about 5 topics today. I do apologise, I seem to be losing my voice, so if it's a bit crackly, I'm sorry about that. First of all, we're going to talk about the purpose of investment, the purchasing structures that you have, the options open to you in investing in property. I'm going to give a brief overview on the conveyancing process. Have most people bought property before? Yeah. So I won't go too much into that. I'll talk a bit about finance and the different options for finance and what you need to think about when you're considering finance. And I'll finally talk about due diligence and the kind of searches that you should think about from a legal point of view. So one thing I will say at the outset is that I'll talk about some things that might overlap with some of the things that David will talk about from an accounting point of view, that Roland might talk about from a financial point of view, financial planning point of view, and Robin and Scott might talk about from a real estate point of view. But that's because there's different aspects to all these parts about investing in property. So if there's the same topic talked about twice, that's because I'm looking at it from a legal point of view and the others are looking at it from their point of view, which is slightly different. And that's why we put the seminar on, because it's different topics for each person. And everyone together provides the advice that gets you the best structure and the best return on your investment. Okay? So one of the first things you need to think about before you invest in property is what's the purpose of the investment? Because there are mainly 4 or 5 reasons to invest. The first one is to invest in capital growth. So that's where you buy a property for it to increase in value and you take the profits at the end of the day when you sell it. The second one is development, which a lot of people like to do and like to think about doing. So buy a block and look at developing it into units or to split it in half or to put townhouses on it. So you need to think about the type of property that you want to do and the reasons for buying the development property. The third one would be long-term rental. So if you want to just make a rental income and live off the income, we have plenty of clients who do that. They buy a property and pay cash for it and then live off the rental return to pay for their lifestyle. Reduction of income tax, so that's negative gearing. I think David's going to talk a bit about that. People have different views on whether or not you should buy properties to reduce your income tax, but that is one option that you can do. And fifth is a combination of these. So you might buy property for capital growth, and in the meantime get rental income to have it pay for itself over the long period. So you need to have a think about what you're trying to achieve, and that's something that Roland will talk about. What you're trying to achieve, so that you know the kind of property that you want to buy. The second part is the purchasing structure. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can buy property. You can buy it in your own name. You can set up what we call a Pty Ltd company, which is basically a private company, or a trust. And there are 3 options for a trust. You've got a discretionary trust, a unit trust, or a superannuation fund. Basically, the difference is where legal liability for the property sits. So if you buy a property in your own name, the legal liability sits with you personally. Now, you can have insurance, and I would recommend that anyone who invests in property has the right insurance in place, but the legal liability, if something happens with that property, still rests with you. If you set up a private proprietary limited company, then you can, the liability is shifted to that company. So if anything happens with the property, it's in the company, it's not with you personally. From a trust point of view, the discretionary trust is like a family discretionary trust, which people may have, and that's where you can buy a property in a trust and then distribute the income amongst the different beneficiaries in the property. A unit trust is basically it's kind of like a company in the sense that each person owns units in a unit trust, and they can take income based on the value of the property that that's sold in equal proportions, or the proportion that they have in the unit trust. And the final one is superannuation funds. So we've done some talks before about buying in self-managed super, and there are certain rules about how you buy properties in self-managed super if you're borrowing money and things like that. But you need to have a think about what vehicle you want to use to buy the property. And this is something that I know David will talk about in relation to the tax consequences, because there are different tax consequences for each of those as well. From a legal point of view, we want to see you limit your liability. So buying property in your own name, unless there's a good tax reason for it, we'd always discourage that from a legal point of view and want to look at a company or a trust. Any questions on that?
You've got a discretionary trust and there's 2 people in it, so can you add more people, or how would you go about doing that?
You can add more people. Usually a discretionary trust will have a definition which has, say, yourself and another family member, often husband and wife, and then it will include all your other relatives as potential discretionary beneficiaries. If you want to add someone else in, you can do that, but there can be tax consequences. So it can be considered a resettlement of the trust, and it's all dependent on circumstances and everything. But the short answer is yes, you can, but you've got to look at the consequences of that and get the right advice first.
If you've got family members, it doesn't trigger that?
It won't trigger that if they're already included as part of the definition of beneficiaries. So like our standard trust deed will have, might have yourself and your wife listed as primary beneficiaries, and then all of your relatives will be beneficiaries, and all your other companies and trusts will all be beneficiaries. And so you don't have to add them in later on. That makes sense? Any other questions? It's easy. So the process. So I think most people put their hands up and said they had bought property, so I'll be really brief about this. You enter into a contract after you've gone to find the right property and sourced everything. Arrange finance through a finance broker or directly with the bank, or pay cash if you've got cash. Arrange building and pest inspections and do your due diligence. And I'll talk about that next because that's really vitally important. Then what we do is we then coordinate all the parties for settlement. And often people get to settlement, which is the final step, and they say, what have we paid you for? You haven't really done anything, because at settlement, everything's organised, and all that happens is the settlement clerks turn up and they just hand over checks. But all the hard work's done before, working out settlement figures, working out where the money's coming from, where the money's going. All that happens in the background, and then parties go and settle the matter in a nice, timely fashion at the settlement. Finance. So this is the finance to purchase the property. So if you're not lucky enough to have the cash, then you need to speak to a mortgage broker, and we've got one here. And they can help you to find the right finance to buy the property. And the finance will obviously be dependent on the structure that you buy the property in. And they're all different rules about what finance for what structure. But you need to speak to a good mortgage broker who knows what they're talking about, so they can get you the right finance. The other alternative is cash purchase. So if you are lucky enough to have the cash, then pay the cash up front. But if you are doing that, make sure you tell people first. Tell your solicitor first. You'd be surprised how many times we get close to settlement and we've asked the client, where's the money coming from? Where's the money coming from? Oh, it's stuck in another account over here and I can't get the money out for another 14 days. And that takes it over settlement. So we need to know up front how you're buying it, so that we can make sure that we organise the settlement properly for you. The next thing to think about is your stamp duty. So stamp duty is a necessary evil that we all have to pay when we buy property, unless you're buying a first home in certain circumstances. But you need to factor that into any finance and your borrowing requirements to make sure that you've got the stamp duty. The other thing that most people do forget is land tax. So land tax is a tax that's put on property that you own, and based on the amount of property that you own, the state government taxes you for based on the unimproved capital value, which is the value that the council or what the council rates are worked out on as well. So the land tax, if you buy multiple properties, you need to think about what your land tax liability is, because all of a sudden you might own 2 or 3 properties, or even 2, and you might start paying land tax that you didn't realise you had to pay. So always get the right advice and make sure that you factor that into any investment decision that you're making, to make sure that you're able to pay for all these other taxes that come out at the end of the day. Due diligence. So I spoke about this before. Due diligence is making sure that you're happy with the property and that the property is in the right condition for you to basically go forward and be able to own it in a safe fashion. So one thing that a lot of people don't do are valuations. If you do a valuation on a property, to speak to a registered valuer to find out what the value of that property is and make sure you're not getting I won't use the word I was going to use, but I'm getting ripped off. Yeah, there's been a lot of problems. Thanks, Rob. There's been a lot of, especially in this area, property spookers who have sold a lot of properties for what is overvalued, and people didn't get valuations before they bought the properties. And now, I know from just talking to local real estate agents, there's a lot of pushback because people are trying to sell those properties and they're not worth what they paid for them. And so if those people had got a valuation done, they would have known that the value of their property that they were buying wasn't worth what they were told by the property spooker. That's dying down a bit, but it's something to think about when you're buying it. I'm a surveyor. We have a lot of clients who say, oh, we don't need to get a surveyor to come in and look at the boundaries of the property. And then they find out later that there's a building that encroaches on the side of the property. Now, we had an example of a commercial property recently where a client bought a commercial property, and it turned out that the shed that was on it was 30 centimetres on the other property. And so now they've got to go through a whole process to get that changed because they didn't get a survey done before they bought the property. So these little things that we see pop up, they don't pop up every time. Often they don't pop up. But if you do the right due diligence, then you can make sure that they don't become problems later on. Building inspections. Again, really important to get building and pest inspections to make sure that the building's up to date and that there's no problems. I mean, I've looked at properties before where there are bricks falling out of the walls and things like that in not just this area, in lots of other areas as well. And you might not notice them, as a layman, but you get a building inspector to go in and check it out, and they can pick up all that stuff. Same as pest inspections. So pest inspectors to make sure that there's no termites if you're buying a wooden house, especially, or a wooden framed house. Really important that you get that done right, because if you don't do it and you find out later, then you lose all your rights to recover anything off the seller later on. And the last part where we really come in as lawyers are the searches, making sure that you get the right searches done of the property. Once again, experience in this area, or not just this area, I shouldn't say that, in southeast Queensland dictates that you should always do like a building record search to make sure that all of the additions to the property and the whole property is approved properly. Too often we see that doesn't happen, and if you don't do the right searches, you don't find out about that. It happens from everywhere, from Sunshine Coast down to the Gold Coast and out to. It happened to you, John?
Yeah, it happened to me.
Yeah.
I went unconditional.
Yep.
And the building wasn't signed off.
Yeah.
They couldn't find it.
And in that case, the standard contract that's provided by the REIQ says that too bad, you've got to buy the property.
Yeah. Fortunately, it went through okay, but it could have been a disaster.
Absolutely. And a lot of the times people, when they're selling, don't realise that something isn't approved that's been from 2 or 3 buyers before that because they didn't do the right search. So you're better off just doing the search. It's a few $100s, but it's worth every penny. And we see it all this far too often. We see it people who get ripped off by by a seller who doesn't disclose those kind of things to a buyer. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. Has anyone got any questions for me before I hand over to David?
Jeremy, can I just ask your opinion? Joe Blow buys a property last week and he had his pest and building done, but it fell over on finance. So a new buyer comes into the scene and he goes to contract, and the agent might mention that there's been a pest and building done a week previous.
Yep.
If you were acting for the purchaser, would you accept that pest and building that had been done a week previous?
I would speak to the building and pest inspector, find out who it was first, find out whether they were willing to assign that building and pest inspection over to the buyer, and then I'd have a discussion with the buyer. I would probably err on the side of no, just getting a new one done, because you don't know what instructions they receive. Because when you get a building and pest inspection, as the buyer, you instruct the building and pest inspector what to look for, what to do. So they may not look at things that you're concerned about. So it really is dependent on the circumstances, but ordinarily probably get it again. It's a few $100s just to make sure that it's done right. You don't have any other questions?
If you built up a bit of a property portfolio over a period of time and you bought it in one partner, knowing the tax benefits or whatever, then your circumstances change and you want to spread that to the other partner.
Yep.
Is that only possible on your principal place of residence, or can you do it on?
If you buy, that's a complicated question. You can definitely do it, but you have to pay stamp duty on some properties. There is a rule that if you own a property before you get married, and then you get married, then you can actually gift half of that property to your partner.
They're going to get it anyway.
That's a cheap way out there. but there is that rule. So if you own it before you get married, that you can gift it over, gift half of it over. But other than that, you can do it, but you've got to pay stamp duty at the higher rate and on valuations that are market values.
Even on your principal place of residence?
Yep. But if you
the
buy,
only thing you'll avoid on principal place of residence is you won't make capital gains. But if you have 3 investment properties and you want to transfer it over to your wife, for example, you'll pay stamp duty and capital gains. Because you'll trigger the capital gains provisions.
So you can't have it.
Yeah.
All right, no other questions?
No comment.